covering MENA, Pakistan, and Central Asia. And I'm delighted to be with you today to moderate this session with distinguished speakers, both policymakers and practitioners, to discuss this topic and build on a newly published paper that you can find online and will be posted in the chat. We have with us today, first, Dr. Jihad Azour, Director of the Middle East and Central Asia Department at the IMF. Welcome, Dr. Azour. Ms. Olfa Hamdi, Founder and CEO of Concord Project Technologies. His Excellency, Mr. Taimur Ishmetov, Minister of Finance, Uzbekistan.
Hello.
Dr. Alan Russo, hello. Dr. Alan Russo, Managing Director, External Relations and Partnerships, and Interim MD, Economic Policy and Governance at the EBRD. And last but not least, of course, His Excellency Hisham Tawfiq, Minister of Public Business Sector in the Arab Republic of Egypt. Thank you all for joining us today and welcome to this webinar. A few words on how we will conduct this webinar. We will proceed first with 2 or 3 rounds of questions for the panelists, followed by a question and answers from the audience. We have many attendees, which we encourage to submit questions live on social media platforms, both Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, and or on Zoom question and answer icon. For those attendees who are not speaking, we would appreciate if you could keep your cameras off and mics muted. We'll start first with a first round of questions with all the panelists, and I'll start by focusing maybe on the size and role of state-owned enterprises in the Middle East and North Africa. The first question to Mr. Azour. Dr. Azour, obviously the IMF has just published this paper, and it comes for people, many of us, on very timely for markets, for policymakers. It's a paper on SOEs, their size, role, performance, and challenges in the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia region. Why such a paper now? And what are the findings and the issues that you have identified in this paper?
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Aya, thank you very much for moderating this important session. Why this study? In fact, the purpose of this study is to help countries deal with 2 important issues: accelerate the recovery in the post-COVID era, and also prepare for the great transformation that those economies will need in order to build the future for the next 5 to 10 years. As you rightly said, it comes at a pivotal moment for many countries in the region. And this is a collaborative work we did with EBRD and extensive, I would say, contribution by authorities, because it was based on a survey that many ministries and government agencies in our countries have participated in filling. What we have tried in this paper is to answer 3 key questions. The first one is how strategic this important sector, which is the SOE sector, is. And what can we say about their performance and the role that they can play in the recovery? What the analysis showed that on average, the number of SOEs in the region, both MENA and Central Asia Caucasus, is higher than what we see, for example, in OECD. In certain countries, it could reach hundreds, and in few cases, it could go up to thousands. And the second question is, do they contribute extensively to economic activity, and how they perform? And here, of course, when we look at their economic footprint, it's different between countries. There are strategic sectors, like, for example, those in oil and gas or in certain strategic industries. But also, you would be surprised to see that they are spread into sectors that you wouldn't think that the public sector will be in. Like, for example, when you, in certain cases, they are working in garment, in restaurants, etc. Therefore, the footprint sometimes exceeds what is strategic for their role. When it comes to their performance, on average, in 1/3 of the countries, the deficit or the losses they incur requires a transfer of almost 2% of GDP. Mind you that 2% of GDP is what the region has used as a fiscal stimulus to address the COVID crisis. 2% is almost equivalent to what is being spent on social on average in those countries. Therefore, performance needs to be improved. The strategic positioning need to be strengthened. The second question that we try to address is, are they promoting growth? Because at the end of the day, the role of the government is to create jobs or to help economy become more competitive. And here we see that many of those, in fact, do not contribute equivalent to their size or to their footprint. And as I mentioned earlier, there are in activities and sectors where we think the private sector is able to operate. Dairy product, furniture, textile, soap factories. Those are definitely not strategic industries. Therefore, in terms of job creation and in terms of their contribution to improving competitiveness, here there are things to improve. And the third question is how these companies are run. And this is also an important dimension because the state is accountable to citizens, and those are, in fact, public money that are being used. And here also, we analyze their transparency, their governance, and how they operate. And of course, here there are improvements that can be made. In terms of governance, there is a great difference between what is de facto happening and the de jure. A lot of those SOEs have, I would say, institutional framework, yet in terms of real implementation of those, things can improve. And the oversight by the state is in certain cases lacking, and in certain countries, the registrar of those companies is in certain cases missing. Therefore, in fact, this study tried to shed light on those important levers that can be used as growth levers, provided capacity for countries to compare and to benchmark with other countries in the region and outside the region. And the ambition of this paper is to help countries in the transformation that we are currently considering as the key priority. It comes with other additional analytical work and support that the fund is trying to provide to countries in the region to address those challenges. Let me stop here, and maybe I can later give you some insights about the key recommendations that this paper came up with.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Azour. And I'll jump on something you mentioned, governance, and I'll turn to Mr. Russo. Mr. Russo, there is a lot of attention on governance, obviously, and perhaps this is even bigger issue when it comes to SOEs. So from your standpoint, what do you think are the main SOE governance issues globally and regionally that we need to turn to? And how does the region compare with respect to international best practices?
Thanks very much, Aliyah. I think it was a great overview and introduction, by Jihad on the study, which we, of course, were really pleased to be a part of with the IMF, and very pleased also to be part of today's event. And you've asked, I think, a really key question that we focus on a lot. I mean, the first thing I would want to say here is that state ownership, as the report that we've done with the IMF shows, and as our most recent transition report has shown, is a significant feature in the economies of the EBRD region. And it doesn't appear to be going anywhere anytime soon. Support for the state and for state ownership in EBRD countries is growing, especially amongst younger generations. And this is in part due to the impact of COVID. So if that's the case, really the key question becomes how to organize state ownership and make it efficient and productive in those areas where it makes sense. And I think Jihad was clear that there are some areas that are strategic and make sense and others less so. So this means establishing sound company level governance, creating a level playing field among state and privately owned companies, what we refer to as competitive neutrality, and increasing transparency. And let me focus on each of those just very, very briefly. If countries get these things right, SOEs can deliver broader benefits for society and the economy. So taking more risk, cushioning shocks, providing affordable services in disadvantaged regions, assisting in the structural transformation to a greener future. If they get them wrong, SOEs can hamper productivity growth, innovation, and promote distortions due to political interference. So if I look at first the organization of the state ownership function, best international practice is set by the OECD guidelines, really require that the state defines and communicates its commercial and non-commercial objectives for SOEs under the umbrella of a state ownership policy. Unfortunately, in many countries in the region where we operate, we do not see an effective ownership policy. And even where it does exist, it's rarely put into practice. And this is why we've been stepping up our policy engagement to try to correct that. One of these gaps in the country, in Uzbekistan, for example, we're going to hear more from the minister soon, has led us to support them in the adoption of their own ownership policy document, which we've provided through the support of EBRD donors. We've also done the same in helping to develop a state ownership policy for Morocco. But overall, the region lags behind on key questions like the issue of centralizing ownership, which can lead to diffused ownership and responsibility. Looking at company level corporate governance, most governments really seem to struggle with setting up professional, independent, and sufficiently empowered structures that would insulate SOEs from political interference in their operations. So many countries in the region have significant gaps with SOE board composition rules relative to international best practice. They lack competency or independence requirements, as well as an impartial selection process. The third issue I would look at is creation of a level playing field, what I refer to as competitive neutrality. This, unfortunately, is oftentimes bypassed in conversations on SOE governance. But really, SOE efficiency is critically dependent on the existence of fair market competition and regulation. That will mean getting the most out of SOEs in the markets in which they operate, but also ensuring access for private sector companies where there is the potential for competition, where there's no natural monopoly, for example, held by the state. So many SOEs in the region enjoy a range of protections and benefits that put them in a stronger competitive position vis-a-vis private sector players. And on top of that, in some countries, we see extensive government support measures, guarantees, subsidies that remain in many countries. So this brings me to the final point, which is around transparency. I think it's really critical that there is more transparency in this sector, that there's better financial reporting and auditing requirements to bring these countries more in line with international guidelines. In practice, SOE performance data has not been available in most of the countries in which we operate. So let me just finish by saying this. I think the state can either extend a caring hand guiding economies toward post-COVID sustainable and inclusive growth, or it can extend a grabbing hand, siphoning off resources intended for people in need, directing them towards cronies and insiders, and retarding broad-based growth and innovation. And I think strong institutions, well-formulated and implemented policies and good governance is the best way to guarantee the former over the latter. And I'll stop there.
Absolutely, and thank you very much, Mr. Russo. Your Excellency, Minister Tawfiq, I'll turn to you now. And obviously, we know you have worked with many SOEs in your own country, Egypt. What are the main reasons and objectives to have a large number of SOEs, and how do you evaluate the outcomes against the objectives more broadly or in your own country?
Okay. First of all, I would like to thank IMF and EBRD for organizing this webinar. And let me assure you that it is not the intention to have a large number of state-owned enterprises, but this is a fact, and we have to live with it. But what's important here is, what are we doing to enhance the performance, or what are we aiming for, whether at the short term or the medium and long term? Let me go back to a couple of comments that were made on governance, on fiscal implications, and on performance. As a basis for any measurable plan, we have changed the laws. So we have changed the law governing the state-owned enterprises, and we have introduced what should have been introduced 30 years ago to make sure that we have proper governance. So what we did, we are enabled now to put standardized policies and procedures for all state-owned enterprises. So it's not up to the General Assembly now or the Board of Directors to come up with any policies and procedures. We have put an end to the loss-making companies. Now, by law, it's not up to the General Assembly, it's not up to the minister, it's not up to the president even to allow loss-making companies to continue. So we have a law which says that loss-making companies, within 3 years, they either have a turnaround or they are forced to liquidate. So this is as far as the fiscal concern is there. On performance, we have set the minimum basic wages in our companies, and we have linked the payments, the excess payments, to the performance and to the profits of the company, and this is in the new policies and procedures. So it's not again up to the directors, the board of directors, or even the General Assembly to allow for benefits which are not performance linked. This is what we're doing on the ground to make sure that we are not living or continuing to live with loss-making companies endlessly. One more thing. Okay. This is a writer's block, so we will leave the one.
Your Excellency, no problem. We'll have plenty of time to learn more about what Egypt is doing, which yes, I know is very important. We'll turn maybe now to His Excellency Minister Ishmetov. Minister Ishmetov, there's a widespread impression, not only in the region, that SOEs are inefficient and unprofitable, as we just heard, with significant fiscal implication. So in your role as Minister of Finance, how do you see the trade-off between the fiscal implication on the one hand and the broader objectives behind the SOE establishment?
Thank you very much. Yes, you are absolutely right. We all know that the SOEs from the one hand side is very costly for the government, and in most cases very inefficient. So what I think, if we look at the experience of Uzbekistan, what we are doing now, we have to focus on the three issues. First, I think each government for themselves have to define what is the goal of this SOEs, and define which SOEs are really needed to keep in the hands of the government for reasons like it's going to end up with the private monopoly if we will going to leave them, or there is still not enough market for the private sector to operate in this area. So I will, for example, give an example in three areas in our case. First, it's energy sector. We used to have, for example, one big oil company who used to do production, transportation and distribution. The same in electricity. We used to have one big SOE who used to generate, to do the transportation and distribution. So we understood that, for example, for the electricity, in the coming 10 years, the demand will be doubled. So we need to double our generation of the electricity, which is very costly for the government, and actually we cannot do it, we cannot afford it. And our idea is to let the private investors to go for this sector. So what we did, for the first, we divided this company for the separate company for the generation, separate transportation, and separate distribution. And we have understanding that for the transportation, both for the natural gas and for the electricity, it's going to be anyway monopoly. So we keep it as a state monopoly instead of letting it to be the private monopoly. But for the production and for the distribution, we have to leave it to the private sector. And for maybe the PPP modality, like public-private partnership. So on the, let's say, energy sector, we focusing to build new production using the private investors. And so we introduced a kind of equal playing field for all the investors. And we declared the focus for the green economy, for the renewable energy. And with the support of the IFIs, like the IFC, ADB, and others, we started the tender procedures for the for the solar photoelectric station and for the wind. And we got a very good results. I will give you one example. In 2019, one of the investors, the company from the Arab Emirates, Masdar, won the tender to build the small solar station with the price of less than 2.7 cents of the American cents. 2 years later is another tender where we have a lot of participants. Now we have the price for less than 1.8 cents of the dollars. So in 2 years, we already have
contributed to fiscal savings.
Exactly. So we are focusing to increase our production generation of the electricity using the private sector. So our focus here is to give it to the private sector. Government only provide the land and provide guarantees that they will buy all the electricity which they produce. That's it. Others, the private sector. Another case is for the mining sector. We have two big mining companies, but they have very big impact on the budget. The overall revenue from these two companies is a quarter of our budget, including taxes and the dividend which they pay. Very good companies, and it's very risky for us to think about letting them go to private. So we do not have those plans in this area. But we decided that we have to allow other new players to come to the market, to the mining industry. So we have changed recently the taxation to make it more attractive for the investors and allow any players to come to bid and take new places. And for those two state-owned companies, anyway, we started some transformation process with the aiming of going to the partial IPO in coming years. And to do so, we have created a proper corporate structure. We even started to hiring professionals from the abroad. Like, for example, for one of these mining companies, we now announcing that we are hiring, let's say, chief financial officers and a couple of the positions from the prominent big companies in the world in this mining industry. And our aim is to make sure that there will be efficient corporations, and this IPO process is kind of one of the ways is to introduce additional third-party audit for such companies to make sure that they will operate efficiently. And the third example is the transportation. If we see, for example, the airports, we understand that we cannot think about letting them going private. This is a strategic kind of places, but we are focusing on the PPP modality, public-private partnership in this area. So in 3 areas, different approach, and I think each country has to decide for themselves.
Thank you
and
very
as
much.
I said,
Okay, sorry, Mr. Minister.
And for the rest of all, I think we are aiming to just sell off the non-necessary companies. For example, currently, if identified, we have more than 2,500 SOEs. Well, most of them are very tiny assets. So out of them, 1,200 we are just putting for sale this year. Just sell it and get rid of it.
Ambitious reform agenda, Mr. Minister. I'm sure we'll have more to ask you about in the second round, but I'll turn to Ms. Hamdi, who is someone that was tasked to manage an SOE herself. And I would like to ask you, what did you find as the key challenges, especially when it comes to improving the firm's commercial viability and orientation, and eventually making it viable for further reform or for private sector participation? Were the stated objective consistent with other implicit mandates?
First of all, thank you so much for the invitation. Happy to be here. I'm also happy to see two major institutions paying attention to the subject, simply because, it is my core belief that for Tunisia specifically, we cannot talk about any serious economic reform plan without a clear, detailed plan on how to reform SOEs, because they are an important pillar to the Tunisian economy. To put things a little bit in context, we tend to think of SOEs as this one entity, but they tend to be multiple entities. So when I was managing Lead in Tunis Air, I was also president and CEO of 6 other companies in parallel, covering a range of activities from airport handling operations across the entire nation to other activities like catering, technical maintenance, and so on. So over 8,000 employees. And so the corporate structure, even though it's not formalized in a holding company or a group, tends to be also one of the reasons that these entities are hard to reform in a way. But among all of the challenges, and I actually would like to add an element around some misconceptions about SOEs. We tend to think that they tend to benefit primarily from government support. But a lot of commercial SOEs, I'll talk about Tunisia specifically, have been cash cows somehow for the government. And governments in a way got, the state got a little bit comfortable in taking advantage of that without that showing in the budget and the soundness of the budget anyway. So among a lot of the challenges, I'd like to highlight 2 major ones, which I believe are key for reforming these entities. The first one is the challenge of transparency, and the second one is the challenge related to the role or the unhealthy role of the unions in filling in the executive gap within the management of these SOEs. When it comes to transparency, so for example, a commercial SOE like Tunis Air is listed in the Tunisian stock market, which by Tunisian law means that it is required to disclose its financial statements and obviously quarterly indicators and so on. That has not been the case for a number of years. So part of my mandate as reforming the airline when I took its leadership is to be fully transparent. Now, the market actually responded quite positively, even though we showed a loss in revenue due to COVID and many other reasons. But the government represented by the Ministry of Finance, and I would like to highlight the importance of the Ministry of Finance in managing in the agenda for SOEs, actually has its own implicit strategy, which is to take the airline off the stock market, which in my belief was a step backwards, not a step forward toward reform. Transparency is important. The second topic is the second challenge, which is so important for Tunisia specifically, Tunisia's public sector and SOEs, is this relationship between the executive leadership, the government, and the union, and this implicit mandate that we need to pay for social peace, no matter what the cost is. Now, today, Tunisia's democracy is actually fragile, again, by the lack of economic reform and the lack of growth and the deteriorating economic conditions. SOEs play an important role in that. We cannot maintain social peace because with this excuse, because the cost of social peace is social peace. I'll share just one example and close with that. So, when you're trying to reform an SOE and then the government policy is to, issue executive orders allowing one union to actually go and collect union fees for the entire year from all SOEs inside the country in advance, while managing an airline or a company that is actually facing some, financial issues, I kind of like refused to make that happen. I requested an exception in a way for the airline for that, on the ground that, first of all, we cannot pay union fees on unworked labor without actually getting that guarantee of productivity. And I would like to highlight the importance of productivity in reforming SOEs. And it is part of rationalizing the reform agenda on these. So taking it from the political, purely political, to the rational and bringing productivity into the picture. That was obviously, that was not the government's policy, which led to this obviously issue with the union initiating strikes and so on. And so
no doubt the unions and the tension between the social objectives and those of efficiency are always present. And we'll come back to the.
No, actually, I would like to highlight it's very important. Social objectives are also commercial objectives too, in the new way we look at corporations. And union leadership demands are not by always actually representative of social objectives. And that's what I would like to highlight, is that the reason I took that job is because I believed in the airline, but also I saw the employees there. They wanted to work, they wanted to be productive, they want to improve their salaries, they want to create this, a competitive entity in the region. But again, the environment, the government policy and the political environment does not incentivize productivity. So social objectives are inherently in line with good commercial objectives of these entities.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Hamdi. And this takes us back to the recommendation, Dr. Azour, because obviously we've heard from the panelists about how they are approaching the challenges of reform. And maybe the paper has many recommendations to address these gaps and challenges, whether in performance, governance, and fiscal areas. Can you highlight, please, the key recommendation, and especially what you think are the quick wins that could garner public support for further reforms in the SOE area?
Thank you, Alia. And let me start on a positive note. I think we saw during the discussion that countries have already started and are moving, and there are success stories. And second, there is no one size fits all. And therefore, our recommendations are broad and need to be put in their context. Let me focus on, I would say, 5 key recommendations that could apply for many of the cases. One is know what you own. The first important step is know the perimeter of what you have under your control, what are the assets you have, what are the nature of those companies, their activities, the size of their assets. You would be surprised, in several countries, this registrar doesn't exist. And it's not communicated to the public or to the parliament. This is the first step for transparency, but also first step to increase your capacity to leverage what you have as assets. Which brings me to the second point, be strategic. As owner, you need to set objectives, clear objectives for those SOEs that need to be updated on a regular basis. And also you need to make sure that while you are carrying those activities, you are providing a public good, i.e. support to the private sector, not to compete or
the internet.
Did we lose Dr. Azour? I'm not sure, did we lose it? Okay, I think we lost for a moment Dr. Azour. We'll get back. We'll back to him. Maybe I'll move to Mr. Russo. Mr. Russo, the paper suggests that there are large gaps in de jure SOE corporate governance compared to the OECD guidelines, as you just mentioned, and particularly in the areas of ownership, as well as fiscal and policy interactions with government. Why is it so critical to close these gaps, not just the de jure one, but also the de facto ones?
Thanks, Aliyah. I think both are clearly important. You know, it's evident to us in the report, I think, that Jihad was trying to get across to us is very clear that improved corporate governance is going to lead to better SOE performance and reduce you know, opportunities for clientelism and political interference, et cetera. So you know, you have these twin problems. First is understanding exactly what needs to be done, and then ensuring that when you've set that up and you've put in place the institutions, laws, policies, frameworks, et cetera, that align with international best practice, that they actually work as intended. So I think both are important. Good corporate governance isn't obviously only about having the right laws and policies in place. It's about whether or not those are consistently enforced. And we kind of work on both sides of the problem in a way at EBRD. So in our policy dialogue, we might work with some countries to put those laws and policies in place first, but we don't stop there because we recognize that they oftentimes will need help also in you know, in implementation. Sure that, you know, when you've set out an approach at the country level, it is country specific, that you're avoiding the problems that we've seen in some cases where you know, the approach taken has certain design flaws in it, or it can be subject to misinterpretations. It might be too broad or too principle based and not fitted to the realities of the country that you're working in. But then you get to the issue of having a framework that is not enforced in practice. So if we look, for example, at some of the countries, you know, where we're working, you know, you might find that countries have, you know, established an ownership policy, or they have an ownership document, but the content of that document may not necessarily be aligned with the OECD guidelines in the first instance, or simply may not be implementable in the form in which it has been adopted. A good other example I would point to is where you have appointment of properly qualified and independent board directors, which can of course make a big difference in SOE performance, but there can be nuances in regulation and practice that are important. So here again, the bank is working with clients to try to combine technical assistance on setting up the regulatory frameworks themselves for board nomination, but also with practical support in implementation and establishment of those boards. So in our experience, you know, when we've been working on corporate governance action plans with a number of our clients, countries really need to see, you know, what are the fit and proper criteria in the first place as defined by law, and then what are the challenges in implementing that in practice. And so we work with them on those sorts of things. Finally, let me point to the importance of introducing performance setting and evaluation framework. So it's not enough simply to have these sort of de jure practices set up, but also having independent performance setting and evaluation framework. So SOE targets really need to be realistic and substantiated with overall sector policies, as well as with SOE sector-specific strategies, risk profiles, and also touching on their non-commercial activities. So I think the change in legislation is clearly not enough. It doesn't guarantee success just to have those laws on the books. You need to have better reform in practice, and that means working at both sides of the problem. And I just want to say I really liked Olfa's point that she made a moment ago. I think it hints at one of the things we probably also need to be thinking about and maybe talking about, which is the political economy realities of implementing these changes. You know, it's not enough just to say we have a textbook set of guidelines, you know, and then we try to make it happen. You have to take account of the realities at each country level. And Olfa talked about Tunisia, but we can talk about every other country where EBRD is active. If we don't understand those political economy realities, we probably won't design a very good approach to supporting those countries in their reforms.
Okay, absolutely. And as we go back to Dr. Azour to continue his own recommendation that are reflected in the study, the study's recommendation as he was talking through them. Dr. Azour, are you with us? And obviously recognize.
Yes, sorry, I was for some reason lost the connection.
Okay, no problem.
Yeah.
So you were walking us through the recommendation of the key recommendations of the report.
Let me go briefly again. know what you own is the first recommendation. Second, be strategic. Be strategic in a sense. Set objectives to those SOEs and regularly update what are their strategy and make sure that they are in fact supporting the growth of the economy and not the other way around. Three is monitor their performance, not only assessing the cost structure or the profitability, but also the risk on the balance sheet. And the balance sheet of the state is usually one of the main hidden risks that those SOEs could create. The fourth recommendation is look at the big picture. Ultimately, what is important for the state is to grow the economy. And this has to start with leveling the playing field between SOEs, private companies, and allow a long-term growth journey, whereby the role of the SOEs is to support a long-term growth. We saw, for example, in the case of Uzbekistan, as Minister Ishmetov was saying, investing in electricity is needed. The state cannot do it. The private sector could help in that. Last but not the least is plan the journey. This is a long-term process, and therefore you have to focus on what are the quick wins, what you can do in the short term, but also what you need to prepare for a big transformation. Here, it's not what is recommended to rock the boat. What is recommended is to make sure that gradually you are making your economy more competitive, you're creating more jobs, and you have a set of entities that are promoting job creation, working on improving the human capital, increasing the capacity to attract FDIs, because this is one of the issues that over the last decade, since the global financial crisis, our region is suffering from. And therefore, it's very important to plan, communicate, and also be very clear and transparent with investors, with your population, as well as also with your social partners, unions, as well as also others, including Parliament. I think with those 5 broad recommendations, there are many other specific recommendations in this report that tackle some important issues that countries who are managing those SOEs are facing. Let me stop here.
So absolutely, Dr. Azour, and I do encourage everybody to read this very detailed and thorough study that was just published. Maybe here I'll turn to Minister Ishmetov again and to ask about, you spoke about some of the details of the SOE's impact on public finances in Uzbekistan, Mr. Minister. But can you tell us a little bit and maybe briefly what gatekeeping role is the Ministry of Finance called to do in order to control these costs?
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed, there is a big cost related with the SOEs. And in our case, I would divide them in 2 types of the cost. First is related with subsidizing the losses of some SOEs who faces those losses because of the selling their services or the products at the preferential prices or costs, like, for example, heating, electricity, etc. Since they are selling at the cost which is lower than their production cost, obviously, they have a planned losses which we have to subsidize. Another area of the cost is when you have to support some SOEs when they face some operational problems, some shortages of the financial resources, and you either have to provide some loans directly from the budget, or you have to guarantee their debt when they issuing some debt. So if we look at the first type of the expenses, what we are doing is that we are gradually moving from these indirect subsidies to population to the direct subsidies. And while allowing the companies selling their products at the market prices, it's almost 90% done. We're hopefully finishing in coming couple of years. So to do so, obviously, we have created, with the support of the World Bank, UNICEF, ILO, the single social registry, where we have all the families who apply for the allowances. And it was very useful. And in 2 years, we managed to increase the cover of the subsidies, the families, threefold. So currently, we have roughly 15–16% of the families receiving all these allowances from the government, which allows us to introduce the market prices. And the second issues relating the operational expenses of the SOEs. What we are doing is that first we, in the nearest future, are introducing the methodology of the assessing the financial risk for all SOEs. To do so, we asked support of the IMF and we received the technical assistance and already some recommendations which we have on our table to do so. And we are planning to introduce even the yearly limits for the guarantees which we issue as a Minister of Finance. So starting from the next year, we will say no more than this amount of guarantees in general in a country for this year. And we starting to introduce the monitoring of the non-guaranteed debt of the all SOEs. Even it is, according to our methodology, is not public debt, it's the company's debt, but we understand that this is a contingent liability. So in coming months, we're starting to introduce the monitoring closely all their debt based on the fiscal risks of each types of the company. Another issue which we are focusing is the public procurement. We have started with the public procurement a couple of years ago, introduced the new law, the separate transparent system where everybody can see what is different ministries is buying at what prices. Now we are expanding them to the all SOEs for the corporate procurement, and hopefully in coming couple of months we will have the separate web portal where each these SOEs have to publish what they want to buy in advance and where they bought at what price, and let the private market to enter this very, very huge and lucrative market of the public procurement and the corporate procurement of the big SOEs. And the last
okay, sorry. Go ahead.
And the last one, which is already mentioned by all the participants, is the corporate structure of the SOEs, where we'll introduce the specific KPIs and to make sure that they will move toward financial independence from the Minister of Finance. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Ishmetov, and it's clear that what you're saying with this agenda is being reflected in the pricing of risk in the market where I sit in terms of Uzbekistan risk. But moving on to Minister Toufiq. Mr. Toufiq, you were talking that reforming SOEs are usually aimed at improving efficiency and growth. However, in your view, and we just heard from a previous speaker about the importance of the political economy challenges to undertake the reforms. What, in your view, are these political economy challenges looking at Egypt case, and especially when it comes to opening up SOEs to a level playing field with private companies in many of the sectors?
Yes, I can see the main challenge to have the culture itself change and the role of public employees to be reshaped. Actually, we have broken many taboos that employment is guaranteed regardless whether the state-owned enterprise is making profits or not. We have broken this, and we have closed down, we have liquidated 4 big entities, and now the public they accept that the idea of and the objective of having an enterprise, whether it is a private enterprise or a public enterprise, they have to make money. Second thing, there is no social luggage which state-owned enterprise have to pay. We have stated very clearly that we are working on commercial terms, and we have to be actually, as Olfa said, in some of our state-owned enterprises, we were actually bearing the social costs while we have to work on commercial basis. So now we have to really set a new field, and we have done this over the last 2 years. Now we are working only on commercial terms, and we have set the tone that the state-owned enterprise, to continue, they have to have a very clear business model, and they have to do the necessary restructuring. They have to come back and make profits. In my first statement, I come back to what was missing, is that the role of the private sector, and it's very important to stress that our message now to the economy and to the masses is that we are partnering with the private sector wherever possible. And we made it clear that the public servant is not the best commercial door. So now, wherever possible, we have in all forms of partnership, equity participation, profit sharing, O&M contracts. In many industries, we have services like transportation, whether passengers or goods companies. Industrial sector, we have a partnership with the private sector in ammonia, urea, big projects, finishing and dyeing in the textile sector, hotels, not only hotel management, but even hotel development, real estate development. They are all projects open to partnership with the private sector.
Great, thank you so much, Mr. Minister. And as you move to maybe our last question to the panelist, Mrs. Hamdi. I mean, the last year and a half have anything but, of course, been normal due to COVID. And as you rightly said, so SOEs have played in many cases the important roles in handling the pandemic. And so while you were a CEO, how did the pandemic impact the roles and objectives of the company, and particular with respect to the social implication? And do you think the extraordinary support was well targeted and with a clear exit strategy, or will there be a significant scarring down the line?
Thank you for the question. Actually, I would like again to put into question the assumption that the state supports SOEs. It's always not the case. And so, and especially during COVID specifically. Now, I mean, I would say for COVID, I look at it from a business standpoint. As a force majeure, we can consider that, its implication, quantify it on the financial performance of the SOE, let's say for 12 months. Beyond the 12-month mark, we cannot use COVID as an excuse for poor performance, for lack of reform, and for loss of revenue and loss of quality of services and so on. Business objectives, basically. And so in that regard, that's the same thing. I mean, I'll talk about Tunisia specifically. 10 years building a democracy, we can no longer use political instability as an excuse to poor performance in SOEs as a primary component of the economy. So in that regard, I would like actually to offer a number of, that's I think our recommendations when it comes to reform in SOEs during this period and the post-COVID era, because it is my belief that the inherently structural issues of the economy transferred into the SOEs have been magnified by the pandemic and other factors. And so the time to reform is now. So literally reform or die. And you mentioned about the high risk piece of that. In Tunisia specifically, for me, markets served by SOEs are high risk and high reward as well. The potential is way bigger than the issues on the ground. So that's kind of like as a note. So some of the recommendations that I would suggest, number one, for reform in SOEs, the commercial ones that have the potential from a business, pure, objective, rational standpoint, that have the potential for economic success and commercial success, it's important to broaden the shareholder base of these entities. So you put together your reform plan. If the state is able to fund this restructuring or this reform plan, so be it. If the state is unable to fund those, then we could go to employee-owned type of, the employees could have shares in the SOE, the private sector, international lenders, anybody, as a matter of fact, who's willing, who believes in the business model, they can be part of that. And I believe that's an important way to re-energize. And in fact, I think the Tunisian people are ready for that. They kind of like are more, especially the younger generation, they want to be, owners somehow. So the other recommendation is related to privatization. So it's very important to pick 2 or 3 or a number of companies and put them on a successful roadmap to privatization under the assumption that it's the state's primary mechanism for funding itself should be tax collection. And so instead of operating in some sectors, including extractive sectors and so on, going for that tax collection and put in the political debate on what do we do with the tax revenue instead of why are we operating in the sector is important. And finally, I would like to mention that on some SOEs, there are sectors the government has no business being in them. It's ethically speaking. So, for example, the Tunisian government have a monopoly on the tobacco selling business. It's unethical to be selling tobacco and cigarettes to your own people when smoking is a public health hazard to the people. You cannot sell them cigarettes and tax them to go to the hospital afterwards. Anyway, so I think some sectors where SOEs have a monopoly, the government is, and they become political entities used for political reasons. There's that blurred, boundaries between both. Some sectors, we just need to get out of them as a state. So these are some ideas around these recommendations. And I would like to just highlight one thing. Tunisia today is going this political constitutional crisis. We don't have a government, but what I would like to mention is that we already have a lot on the current leadership's plate, trying to figure out a roadmap to sorting our political house. We cannot have them also run the economy. So the economy needs to be let the Tunisian people run their own economy. Stop interfering with the private sector, with prices, with the market, with the entrepreneurship. With the economy has to become inclusive so that it enables growth. And SOEs are a primary factor and foundation for that.
Very strong messages, and I hope that many Tunisians are hearing you, Mrs. Hamdi. So now, as we come close to the Q&A, I would like to, we have received several questions. We're just gonna have a short intervention or question from Ms. Huda Lahresh from EBRD. May I ask you to come to the floor and ask you to be brief, given the timing, so we can ask a few questions to the panelists.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, so sorry. So I just want to add on the example in Morocco, and I'm Huda from EBRD, and I would like to apologize because Dr. Haike couldn't join us. So she apologizes for that. So as an example, Morocco is one of the countries that have dealt with COVID-19, not only as a crisis, but also as an opportunity to spur important reforms that will accelerate economic recovery. During 2020, the government has launched a comprehensive program to restructure its SOEs in order to improve good governance, economic and social efficiency, introduce a level playing field, and reduce fiscal risks. So EBRD as a whole responded with the Vital Infrastructure Support Program, the StateOwned VISP, designed to service emergency financing needs. And as part of the technical assistance that was provided through the aforementioned VISP program under the EBRD Solidarity Package, the bank is supporting the Ministry of Economy, Finance and Administration Reform with the developing of a state ownership policy for Morocco and setting up for an effective centralized ownership policy. So EBRD is also providing urgent liquidity support and direct technical assistance to 3 of Morocco's critical infrastructure providers, namely ONDA, the airport company, the National Airport Company, ADM, and in charge of road management, and ONE Water and Electricity Company.
Thank you, Huda.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for outlining what Morocco is doing with the help of EBRD in reforming its SOE sector. Absolutely. We have a couple of questions, one directly, if you allow me, to share it with the Minister, directly addressed to His Excellency Minister Ishmetov. Mr. Ishmetov, the Uzbek government has embarked, as you mentioned, on this ambitious reform. And the question to you here is, alongside how will the government ensure a transparency in particular? And the question to you is, will there be, is Uzbekistan looking for domestic or foreign investors to take part? And will there be any preference from particular country or region to the other?
Thank you very much. Well, among the many reforms which we have undertaken in the last 5 years, I admit that we were a bit late with the privatization, but we have started from the end of the last year, and we understand that transparency is very important. And we have already done some cases where we tried to provide transparency in a way that investor will believe that it is a true open system of the privatization. And to do so, we even decided to hire external consultants with the big names, like, for example, from one of the companies which we recently announced that, we have Coca-Cola bottlers here, and somehow part of the stakes of this company belong to the government. So it's easy to sell the stake in such a good company, very liquid asset. But we decided to hire Rothschilds, one of the investment banks, to lead this process and let them to lead this process to make sure that they will do it in an open, transparent way, to show the investors that we even do not participate in this process, to let the more investors to participate in the process. We will follow this way, trying to show that we are able to do so. And regarding the preferences, obviously, we would like to have more and more domestic investors, which is to make sure that they will own some assets in their own country. And frankly speaking, we already receive lots of interest when we are selling some assets on the auctions. We see interest from the actually local investors much more than we expected, and we are happy to see so. But it does not mean that we close it for foreign investors. Actually, this is the opposite. For the preference, we do not have any preference for any country, not at all. But there are some, how to say, our preferences which we declare in the certain strategies for sectors. I will give one example on the banking sector. We adopted a strategy for the for 2025, where we openly declared that in case of a banking sector, we are opting for the strategic investors, which means we need quality investors, professional bankers who will come and improve the quality in the banking system. And it does not mean that we will be very happy to sell a bank for any businessman who has a big amount of money, but no any experience in the bank. In other cases, no any preferences. We will try to do it in a most transparent way. Thank you.
There are a number of questions. I think I'll just pass very quickly, maybe one to Jihad. And the question is that in the case of restructuring public companies with significant expenditure in the absence of a PPP framework, what would be the solution for developing countries that lack the fiscal space to do so? And maybe we'll given the time, we'll end on this question, and I apologize for the few other questions we had.
Well, Ali, as you know, each sector is different, and there are sectors where you could have, as we were just hearing, could have private investors or international investors. And some of those companies could be, I would say, in the international competition playing field. Therefore, for those, one of the options is to attract private investors, be it in form of management contract or to the other extreme, which is an outright sell. Therefore, I would say here you have to understand that investors are looking at different opportunities in different countries, and therefore you have to be as close as possible to where market is. And we saw in the case of Uzbekistan, the process, the involvement of experts in the field, including investment bank, is very useful. When it comes to entities in your own market, and therefore where you have a certain number of fiscal implication because of the restructuring, this becomes part of what I would say the normal way of fiscal management, whereby it has to be part of your role as a government. It has to be accounted for in your fiscal operation, and you have to do it in the right way, i.e. you have to provide employees with the capacity not only to be protected, but also to find options elsewhere. Which brings me to the last point that I want to highlight. It's also about developing people. Those SOEs could also be a platform to train, develop people, or in case we need to switch from state-owned to more market-based, is to work on helping through trainings, through capacity building programs, those people to become more competitive or more driven to work in the private sector. At the end of the day, what matters is growth, employment, and provide an equal playing field. And last but not the least, be transparent, because this is public money that you are using.
Absolutely. And on that very informative and clear roadmap that Dr. Azour drew for us, but also the wealth of the information we got from policymakers and from practitioners on the panelists, I would like to thank each one of you, Mr. Minister Ishmetov, Minister Shaoui, Mrs. Hamdi, and of course, again, Dr. Azour. I think the wealth of analysis and information that and Mr. Russo, sorry, I don't see him anymore. Sorry. Okay, sorry, Mr. Russo. I think the wealth of information that the paper has provided and the teams of the IMF and EBRD put in front of us, both in the markets and in policymakers' hand and in researchers' hand, is extremely useful. And I'm sure a lot of us will use it to improve our own understanding of the challenges and the reform agenda that policymakers in the region will face as we move to implement this wide-ranging area of reform with the assistance of institutions like the IMF and the EBRD. We look forward for further discussions to delve more into the findings of this paper, and I thank you again for all the attendees for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.